My wife said that in open court, into a microphone, in front of a judge, 2 lawyers, a court reporter, and a dozen strangers waiting for their own cases. She pointed at me like I was a broken appliance she wanted to throw out, her manicured finger cutting through the air. "He's just a useless husband," she repeated, "and he's not fit to raise our children." Have you ever sat in a room where your whole life was being reduced to a few ugly sentences and you weren't allowed to say a word back? Have you ever had someone you once loved tell a judge you were nothing, while every part of you that remembers late-night shifts and diaper changes and standing in the rain at their bus stop is screaming, "I did everything I could"? I stared down at my hands from looking at her. The cheap court pen dug into my palm, ink smudged on my fingers. Those hands have tightened boats on Humvees in the desert, changed flat tires on the side of the I-85 at 3 a.m., stirred pots of spaghetti so my kids had something hot when she worked late. In that courtroom, they just looked small, poor man's hands. Useless, if you believe the way she said it. My legal aid lawyer had told me, "James, whatever she says, you stay calm. The second you go up, you make her story true. Let her talk. The judge sees more than you think." So I kept my jaw clenched, eyes on the table, every insult hitting like a body blow I had to absorb without flinching. She sat there on the witness stand in her tailored navy suit, hair perfect, makeup done just enough to say respectable without trying too hard. Her attorney paced in front of her, feeding her questions like softballs. "And what does your husband do for work, Mrs. Miller?" "He's a night security guard," she said, with a little shrug that got a murmur from somewhere in the back row. "Part-time, minimum wage. I pay the mortgage, the private school, the medical bills. He tinkers with cars and plays video games with our son." They chuckled at that, a couple of them. People always think you know who you are when they hear your job title and your bank balance. Poor dad in a flannel shirt and off-the-rack slacks must be dead weight. "Would it be fair to say your husband," continued, "has been the primary provider in this marriage?" "Absolutely," she said. "Without me, we'd have nothing. He doesn't have ambition, Your Honor. No real career, no plan. I've begged him to do something, anything more with his life, but he's content to just coast along and let me carry everything." Have you ever heard someone tell a version of your story so twisted you almost don't recognize yourself in it, and then had to admit there's just enough truth in it to make the lie sting worse? It was true she made more money. True she had the respectable job in an office with a badge and a title. True my paycheck looked like a joke next to hers on paper. But the nights I sat in that security booth were the only nights I slept at all. After the sandbox, after the things I'd seen over there, the idea of going back to school, of climbing some corporate ladder, of sitting under fluorescent lights all day trying to remember which version of myself to be for which client, that sounded more like torture than being a man. She never understood that. Maybe I never fully explained it. Or maybe I did, and she just filed it under excuses. "He's emotionally unstable, too," she added, voice dropping a tone. "Gets moody, shuts down. The kids see it. I can't have them thinking that's how a real man behaves. They need stability, not someone who's still stuck in whatever happened to him over there." She said over there like it was a vacation I'd taken, not a war zone we all pretended didn't exist once I came home. My lawyer shifted in his seat, but he didn't object. He told me we'd get our turn, that court was chess, not a bar fight. Wait for your move, don't swing at every insult. "Counselor," the judge said, suddenly turning to my wife's attorney, "may I ask you a question?" The attorney, mid-note, looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Of course, Your Honor." The judge nodded toward me. "Do you do your homework on the respondent's background?" The lawyer blinked. "His background, Your Honor?" "Yes," the judge said, voice still mild but with an edge now. "Did you pull his service record, his employment history prior to his current position? Did you, at any point, attempt to learn who he is beyond his current income?" There was a beat of silence. The attorney opened his mouth, closed it, then stammered, "We reviewed his financials, Your Honor. His current job, that's—" "So no," the judge cut in, "you did not." He leaned forward, eyes locking at me. "Sergeant James Miller, is it?" The room tilted for a second. Hearing that rank out loud after so long, it was like a ghost had walked in. My lawyer's head snapped toward me. My wife's brows knit in confusion. "Yes, Your Honor," I managed. "Formerly." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Do you recall an incident outside Kandahar in 2006? My stomach dropped. Images flashed unbidden. Dust, gunfire, the sickening thud of an IED, dragging a screaming man by his vest toward cover. Things I'd spent years boxing up in the back of my brain. "I do," I said slowly. "Sir." He nodded once. "I do too," he said, "because I was there." A ripple went through the courtroom. Her attorney's pen slipped from his fingers. My wife's face drained of color, the practiced courtroom composure slipping for the first time. Have you ever had the ground you've been standing on, shaky, uneven, full of holes, suddenly feel solid because someone else remembered the part of your story you were sure the world had forgotten? "You really don't know who he is, counselor?" the judge asked again, this time for the record. Her attorney froze, eyes darting between us. My wife turned to look at me like she was seeing a stranger for the first time. And for the first time since she started talking, I lifted my head, met her gaze, and let her see in my eyes all the years, all the miles, all the nights that useless husband had carried this family in ways money never measured. The minute the judge said, "outside Kandahar in 2006, the courtroom walls dissolved, and I was back there. Heat like an oven door to the face. Sand grinding in my teeth, the air full of that thick metallic smell you never quite wash out of your memory. Have you ever tried so hard to shove a chapter of your life into a locked box that you almost convince yourself it didn't happen until someone else opens it with one sentence? We were on a resupply convoy that day. Routine, they called it. Nothing about Afghanistan ever felt routine to me. You get complacent, you get dead. I was Staff Sergeant James Miller then, not useless husband. My world was my squad. Boys barely old enough to drink and one or two lifers like me, clinging to structure because it made sense in a world that didn't. Our job was simple on paper. Get the trucks from point A to point B with all the people and gear still attached. On that particular mission, we had VIP cargo, some JAG officers and a visiting major hitching a ride to another base. I remember clocking the one in the back of our MRAP, the man who would one day sit on that bench in a black robe. Back then, he was just Captain Harris. Clean uniform, soft hands, eyes that had seen more paperwork than patrols. "First time outside the wire, sir?" I asked, half teasing, half checking. "First time this far," he admitted, adjusting his helmet. "Don't worry, Sergeant, I'll stay out of your way." He had, until the road exploded. 2 trucks ahead of us, the world turned white and then orange. The boom hit like a physical thing, rattling my bones. IED. We'd briefed the route, checked for signs, done everything textbook. The Taliban didn't give a damn about our textbook. Smoke, screaming, the radio crackling with half words. I remember grabbing my rifle, barking orders without fully hearing myself. "Cover left. Get eyes on that ridge. Harris, stay down." He didn't, or tried not to. Some instinct made him peek, maybe looking for his men. The second explosion was smaller, closer. Shrapnel tore through the armored plating like it was tinfoil. One of our guys went down with a spray of red. For a second, it was chaos. Then training kicked in. We pushed through, pulled who we could out of the wreck, laid down covering fire until the enemy either decided we weren't worth more ammo or melted back into the hills. When the dust settled, we had wounded, but not dead. That line mattered. In the middle of it, we dragged Captain Harris from where he'd been half trapped under a twisted seat. I remember his face, white as a sheet, lips moving in some legal prayer. "You're all right, sir," I said, more confident than I felt as we hauled him into the shelter of the next vehicle.
He grabbed my sleeve, eyes wild. "You saved my life," he stammered when we finally got him to the aid station. "You and your men. How do I—" "You write better rules," I grunted, already turning away to check on my guys. "That's your lane. This is mine." Years later, he'd done exactly that, I found out. Worked his way up, became a judge, sat in a position where his pen could protect people in ways my rifle never could. I didn't know any of that when I got out. All I knew was that the war had followed me home. What people don't tell you about being the hero in those stories is how useless you feel in regular life afterward. Have you ever gone from making life or death decisions in seconds to standing in a grocery aisle frozen because your brain can't handle 47 brands of cereal? When I rotated back stateside, I thought the hardest part would be missing my squad. Turned out the hardest part was learning how to be a person not defined by rank or rules. The VA docs called it PTSD. I called it not being able to sleep without seeing Harris's pale face or hearing the thud of blown out tires in every slammed door. I tried a couple jobs that looked good on paper, an office security position downtown where my main task was telling drunk executives they couldn't take the elevator up after hours, a warehouse manager gig where the company wanted me to motivate the team with empty slogans while cutting their hours. I lasted 6 months at each before the walls started closing in. The fluorescent lights, the forced small talk, the sense that my real skills, reading a room under pressure, staying calm in chaos, taking care of my people, were as absolutely valued as a rotary phone in a 5G world. That's around when I met Lisa, my wife, soon to be ex-wife, the woman now sitting 10 feet from me telling a judge I was nothing. She worked in HR at the hospital where I was doing night shift security. Freshly divorced, sharp as a tack, the kind of black woman who always had her hair and outfit on point, even on bad days. She called me soldier at first, half joking, half flirting when she came in late and found me doing rounds. "You look like you've seen some things," she said once, handing me a cup of coffee on a graveyard shift. "These hallways bore you?" "Boring ain't always bad," I replied. Last place I worked was a little too exciting. We talked, at first about nothing. Music, movies, the weirdness of night people, then about more. Her son from her first marriage, Malik, who was 6 and obsessed with dinosaurs, my time overseas in the sanitized version I could manage without shaking. She liked that I was steady. I liked that she didn't flinch when I went quiet. We started grabbing breakfast together after my shift ended and before hers began. Pancakes at the Greasy Spoon down the street turned into dates into something that felt like a second chance. Everyone told me it was good for me, settling down, building a normal life. The VA therapist nodded approvingly when I mentioned her. "Stability," he said. "Routine. That's good, James." And for a while it was. She liked introducing me at parties. "This is my boyfriend, James," she'd say. "He served in Afghanistan." Her friends would ooh and ah, ask polite questions about my time there, thank me for my service. One of them slapped my shoulder and said, "Man, I feel safe with you around." It was a performance, sure, but it made me feel seen in a way that didn't involve camo and dust. When we got married 2 years later, Malik wore a little suit and called me Dad in a whisper when no one was looking. I stood in that rented hall, ring in my hand, thinking, this is it. This is my real mission now. Be a husband, be a father, don't screw it up. I never made big money. Night shift, odd mechanic jobs on the side, the occasional contract gig installing home alarm systems, but I was home. When Malik got sick at school, it was me who left the job to pick him up. When Lisa needed to stay late for a meeting, I was the one stirring spaghetti sauce, going over spelling lists, checking under the bed for monsters. "You're so lucky," one of her co-workers told her once at a company picnic, watching me chase Malik around the yard. She smiled then, pride in her eyes. "Yeah," she said, "he's my rock." Funny how rocks become dead weight when people decide they'd rather be carried by something shinier. Have you ever watched appreciation curdle into contempt one small comment at a time? It wasn't overnight. For a while, we were a team. We budgeted together. I took extra shifts when she wanted to take a course to move up at work. She supported me through a rough patch when a news story about a bombing sent me into a tailspin that had me waking up on the floor more than once. When she got promoted to HR director, everything shifted. It came with more money, sure, but also more image. New car, new clothes, new friends who threw dinner parties where everyone talked about scaling their portfolios and leveraging equity. I'd show up in my one decent button-down and listen, nursing a beer, feeling like a ghost at my own wife's table. They'd ask, "And what do you do, James?" And when I said security at St. Mary's, they could see me slot me into a file in their minds. Blue collar, background, not like us. Lisa started making jokes. At first, they were small. "You know, James," she'd laugh, "he's married to that guard booth. Man won't even consider a day shift." Or, "He's allergic to ties, I swear." We laughed together then. I thought she was on my side, making fun of the expectations, not of me. But the jokes sharpened over time. "I'm the only one in this house with a career," she'd say when the conversation turned to promotions. "James just plays at work." "I pay the bills," she'd remind me when we argued about money, jabbing a manicured finger at the stack of envelopes on the counter. We fought about stupid things and big ones. I'd say, "I keep this house running in other ways," and she'd roll her eyes. "You babysit your son and change some oil. Congratulations. Do you want a cookie?" It cut deep because part of me believed her. My nightmares about firefights and IEDs had quieted some, but they still lurked. The VA counselor and I had talked about maybe trying for a different role, going back to school on the GI Bill. Every time I'd bring it up, something would happen. Malik would need braces, the car would die. Lisa would say, "We can't afford for you to play student on top of everything else." So I shelved those dreams, told myself being present was worth more than a degree, told myself she knew that too. Heck, maybe she did once. But the more her world revolved around titles and salaries, the more my worth shrank in her eyes. She started complaining about me to her friends, loudly, in the next room when she knew I could hear them. "He's so stuck," she'd say, pouring wine. "No ambition. I'm basically raising 2 kids. You know how it is." They'd nod, empathetic, because every woman at that table probably had her own gripes. None of them knew that while they were comparing husbands' bonuses, I was in the kitchen packing Malik's lunch for the next day, making sure he remembered his science project. As Malik hit his teens, the triangle between us got sharper. He idolized his mother's success, her sleek car, her designer bags. He started parroting her phrases. "When are you gonna get a real job, Dad?" he joked once, not realizing how much it stung. "Like Mom? I have a real job," I said. "Several, if you count the ones nobody pays for." He rolled his eyes. "Mom says if it weren't for you, we'd be broke." "We'd be fine," I lied. "We'd be different, but not destitute." I never explained to him that part of the reason we weren't broke was because I carefully budgeted my VA disability, my small checks, my time. It all came to a head when Lisa decided she was done. "I feel like I'm dragging you, James," she said one night, standing in the doorway of our bedroom like she was already leaving it. "I'm tired. Tired of being the only adult. Tired of having to push you to want more." "More of what?" I asked, exhausted. "More money? More status? I show up for you. From a leak? Doesn't that count?" "It's not enough," she said flatly. "Not for me. Not anymore." The divorce papers came a week later, irreconcilable. She wanted the house, technically in our both names, but mostly paid for by her income, so her lawyer was already salivating. She wanted primary custody of Malik and the younger kid we'd had together, Ava, along the way. She wanted to limit my overnights, citing my unstable work schedule and untreated emotional issues. Have you ever read your own life in legal language and not recognized yourself in any of the bullet points? My lawyer, an overworked, kind-eyed man from the legal aid office, told me the truth. She has the higher income, the more professional job. On paper, that gives her an edge. But custody isn't just about money. It's about who's been there,
Who can provide a safe, loving environment? Your service record, your VA treatment, your consistent involvement with your kids, it all matters. Trusting the system is hard when the system has mostly seen you as a number, but I trusted him best I could. I showed up to every hearing in my thrift store suit. I answered questions calmly. I handed over bank statements that made my stomach twist. I let Lisa's lawyer paint me as small because I didn't know how to argue without blowing up. That's how we ended up in that courtroom. Her voice ringing out, calling me useless in front of a judge who remembered me as something very different. The man whose hand I'd grabbed in a burning convoy, the officer I dragged behind a blast wall while rounds snapped overhead, the person whose life had been woven into mine in a place my wife never cared to ask about. That judge's question, "You really don't know who he is?" hung in the air like a shell that hadn't exploded yet. Have you ever felt the moment when the story someone's been telling about you starts to unravel, not because you finally found your voice, but because the truth walked in the room wearing a robe and called you by a name you thought you'd left behind? That was the moment I realized two things at once. My wife had never really wanted to know the whole of who I was, and the judge did. And suddenly, sitting there in that hard wooden chair, I wasn't just a poor dad in a cheap suit letting my ex write my obituary. I was Sergeant Miller again. I was the man who'd made hard calls under fire, who'd carried more than his share, who'd chosen a smaller life on purpose so his kids could have a safer one. And for the first time since she started talking, I let myself wonder, not how can I defend myself, but what happens when the person in charge already knows I don't need defending?
The judge leaned back, studying me like he was lining my face up with an old photograph in his memory. "Sergeant Miller," he repeated, "you pulled me out of a burning vehicle and into a second one that later took an RPG through the windshield. You kept me alive long enough to have this job. And today, I'm sitting here listening to someone call you useless because you make less money than she does." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The air in the courtroom went thin. My wife's attorney, a slick man with a watch worth more than my car, blinked rapidly. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware of—" "Exactly," the judge said, cutting him off. "You weren't aware, and that's precisely the problem." He turned back to Lisa. "Mrs. Miller, did you know your husband has a Bronze Star?" She frowned, thrown. "He mentioned some things about his service," she said cautiously, "but that was years ago. It's not relevant to—" "Answer the question," the judge said, voice cold. "Did you know?" Her cheeks colored. "Not specifically, no," she admitted. "James doesn't talk about that stuff. He just does his little security job." A bitter laugh almost tore out of my chest at little security job, but I swallowed it. My lawyer's hand brushed my arm under the table, a reminder, stay calm. The judge sighed, long and tired. "Counselor," he said to her attorney, "did your firm bother to pull his military record in your investigation?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "We focused on current financials and employment as they are more pertinent to—" "So no," the judge said again, "you didn't." He turned a steady gaze on them both. "You have built your entire narrative around the idea that this man is lazy, irresponsible, and unfit because his pay stubs are small. At no point did you consider his documented history of leadership, sacrifice, and service. At no point did you ask why someone with his background might choose a lower-stress job. At no point did you factor in caregiving as labor. Have you ever sat there while someone laid out the pieces you've been too tired or ashamed to pick up yourself and realized that for once they weren't arranging them to use against you?" The judge flipped through a thin file the clerk had slid on his bench. I recognized the header from the VA. At some point, someone, maybe my lawyer or maybe the court system itself, had requested more than just my W-2s. "Sergeant James Miller," the judge read aloud, almost to himself. "Enlisted at 19, 2 tours, the convoy, the medals, commendations for valor, led a squad under hostile fire, honorably discharged, VA treatment for combat-related PTSD, no criminal record, consistent employment since separation, consistent involvement in children's schooling per school records. He closed the file with a soft thump. But today, he's useless because he works nights and doesn't wear a tie. Her attorney cleared his throat again, grasping for footing. Your Honor, we are not disputing my client's appreciation for his past service, he said quickly. However, our position is that in the context of this marriage, his contributions have been minimal compared to hers, financially speaking. The issue before the court is custody and division of assets, not his... I'm well aware what the issues are, he said, and I'm also aware that you have framed contributions so narrowly that you've cut the children's actual day-to-day experience out of the picture. He shifted his attention to my wife. Mrs. Miller, who takes the children to school in the morning? She blinked. Usually James, she said reluctantly. My meetings start early. Who picks them up if they're sick? James, my job. She trailed off. Who cooks dinner most nights? He does, she said a bit sharply. He's home more. Who attends parent-teacher conferences? We both try, but if I have a deadline, he... So often him, the judge supplied. Yes, she said tightly. And who took Malik to counseling after the incident with the bullying last year? My head snapped up. How did he know about that? Then I remembered. School records, reports. Nothing really stays sealed when family court gets involved. James did, she said, voice dropping. I was traveling for work. And when you had your promotion interview last year and needed someone to cover the kids for a week of late nights, he pressed. He took some shifts off. Watch them. So, the judge said, ticking points off on his fingers, school, meals, medical appointments, emotional support. These are all handled largely by your useless husband. Is that accurate? Her face flushed a deep, angry red. That's not fair, she snapped. He does those things because he doesn't have a real job to go to. I bring in the money. Without me, they don't have the school, the house, the activities. I can't do it all, Your Honor. I won't. No one is asking you to do all, he said evenly. What I am asking is that you acknowledge that contribution is not solely financial. Parenting is not solely writing a check. Have you ever watched someone with authority refuse to buy the same lies about you that you've been sold for years? The judge whiled through the 1-minute recess. When he returned, he asked if I would come to the stand. My knees softened as I made my way up. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but. Funny, I thought, considering how many years I'd spent telling half-truths about who I was to keep people comfortable. My lawyer approached. James, he began, dropping the formalities we had practiced, can you tell the court briefly about your service background? I told him the basics. Enlisted at 19, 2 tours, the convoy, the medals. I didn't linger, I didn't dramatize, just facts, the way I'd written them on forms 100 times. Then he shifted. And what made you decide to take the kind of work you do now instead of pursuing a corporate career? I glanced at my kids. Malik slouched in his seat at the back, playing with his phone. Ava sitting up straight beside my sister, eyes huge. My kids, I said simply. When I came back, I wasn't right. Nightmares, jumpy. The VA recommended I avoid high-stress environments until I got treatment under control. I tried some office jobs. They didn't go well. I started missing stuff, coming home angry. It scared me. So I picked something I could do well that didn't make me bring the worst parts of me into our house. Night security, mechanic work, things where I could clock out, wash my hands, and still have enough of myself left to read bedtime stories. So you chose a lower-paying job in part to be a better father? He asked. I chose it so I wouldn't become the kind of father who drinks and hits and disappears. If that meant we didn't have a second car as quickly, so be it. My wife's attorney stood up. Objection, Your Honor. This is self-serving. Overruled, the judge said. This is directly relevant to parenting capacity. Continue. James, my lawyer said, can you walk us through a typical week in your household when you and Mrs. Miller were together? I did.
Up at 6 a.m. to make breakfast, making Malik's lunch while yelling for him to find his shoes, driving them to school, napping for a couple of hours before heading to my shift, picking them up on my days off when they were sick, PTA meetings, therapy appointments, the time I sat in the ER with Ava until 3 a.m. when she broke her arm and Lisa was across the country at a conference. None of it sounded glamorous out loud. It sounded like parenting. And during all this, my lawyer asked, what was Mrs. Miller's schedule like? She worked a lot, I said, which was true. HR director, long hours, business trips, nights on the laptop. Would it be fair to say that you were the primary hands-on caregiver? I hesitated, glancing at Lisa. She looked away, jaw clenched. Yes, I said. In terms of hours with the kids, yes. Did you ever refuse to work more or find a different job out of laziness, as has been suggested? No, I said, a bit of steel slipping into my voice. I refused jobs that would have taken me away from my kids 14 hours a day and put me back into areas my therapist said weren't healthy for me. I took what I could handle and made sure dinner was on the table. Have you ever finally said the thing you've been swallowing for years and felt the room actually hear it? The judge leaned forward. Mr. Miller, he said, do you consider yourself useless? I almost laughed. No, sir, I said. I consider myself tired, but not useless. The corners of his mouth twitched. I'll take that, he said. He turned back to Lisa. Mrs. Miller, having heard this, do you still stand by your assertion that your husband is useless? Her chin lifted stubbornly. He's not what I wanted in a partner, she said, evading. He didn't grow with me. I needed more. That may be so, the judge said. You are entitled to your feelings about the marriage. That does not automatically mean he is unfit to parent. He straightened the papers before him. The sound, soft, controlled, felt like the prelude to a verdict. Here is what I see. A man with a documented history of courage and reliability in crisis. A man who, by all accounts, has been the primary day-to-day caregiver for these children. A man who chose less lucrative work in part to be present and in part to manage his mental health responsibly. On the other hand, I see a successful career woman who has provided financially and deserves credit for that, but who has also minimized and weaponized her husband's sacrifices to gain leverage in this courtroom. Her attorney bristled. Your Honor, with respect, you came in here calling him useless, counselor, the judge said, eyes flashing. I suggest you adjust your tone. Have you ever felt someone with power say the thing you've always wished somebody would say for you, and realize this time they finally did? The judge took a deep breath. Custody is not a
prize to be awarded to the parent with a higher paycheck, he said. It is a responsibility. These children are clearly bonded to their father. There is no evidence he is neglectful, abusive, or incapable. There is significant evidence he has been a consistent, stabilizing presence. Therefore, I am disinclined to grant your request for sole custody, Mrs. Miller. Air rushed out of my lungs. I hadn't even known I'd been holding it. Instead, he continued, I am awarding joint legal custody with a 50-50 physical custody scheduled to be worked out by counsel, defaulting to the week-on, week-off plan if you cannot agree. The marital home will remain with Mr. Miller for the next 2 years to provide continuity for the children, at which time it may be sold or bought out at market value. Mrs. Miller's higher income will be factored into a fair child support calculation for the time the children are in Mr. Miller's care. Lisa's mouth dropped. But that is my ruling, the judge said firmly. You will both provide for your children, financially and emotionally. You will both respect the other parent's role in their lives. And you, he added, fixing her attorney with a stare, will remember in future cases that a man's worth is not solely defined by his current tax bracket. Gallop. Boom. Case moved on to the next name on the docket, but my world had tilted. Have you ever walked into a room convinced you were the weakest piece on the board and walked out realizing someone else had been misreading the game entirely?
Outside the courtroom, my lawyer clapped me on the shoulder. "That went about as well as we could have hoped," he said, grinning. "You all right?" I nodded slowly, still in shock. "I think so," I said. Harris, the judge, passed us in the hall a moment later, robes rustling. For a second, he was just the authority figure from the bench. Then he paused, turned, and held out his hand. "Sergeant," he said quietly when I shook it. Up close, I could see the lines around his eyes, the silver at his temples. Time had worked on him too. "Sir," I said, "didn't expect to see you here." "Likewise," he said, a wry twist to his mouth. "You did right today, in there and back then." He squeezed my hand once hard. "Don't let anyone tell you you're useless," he added. "Not after what I saw, not after what I just heard about your kids." Then he was gone, swept back into the current of cases and clerks and paperwork. But his words stayed. Have you ever had someone who knew you at your rawest, a captain in a war zone, look at your civilian, poorer, tired self and still see the same core? That day in court didn't magically fix my life. Money was still tight. Co-parenting with a woman who resented the judge's decision was its own kind of battle. But something fundamental had shifted. I walked out of that courthouse not just with a custody arrangement. I walked out with a question echoing in my head. Not the one my wife had thrown at me over and over, "Why can't you be more?" But the one the judge aimed at her attorney. "You really don't know who he is?" For the first time in a long time, I started asking it of myself.
Life after that day in court didn't suddenly turn into some triumphant movie where I walk out into a slow-motion sunset and everything falls into place. Bills still showed up, my knees still hurt when it rained, my ex-wife still looked at me like I was something she'd stepped around on the sidewalk half the time we had to interact. Have you ever won a battle so clearly on paper and still had to go home and fight little skirmishes in your own head? The first week with the kids on the new schedule, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Lisa to drag me back in court, for the judge to call and say, "We reviewed the decision and made a mistake. Hand them over." That's what happens when you spent years being told you don't measure up. You start expecting the ground to vanish under your feet. At 5 p.m. Monday, though, there they were. Malik with his backpack slung over one shoulder, Ava clutching a stuffed animal, both standing on the porch like this was just normal. Like going to Dad's house for a week, Mom's for a week, is unremarkable as switching classes at school. "You guys hungry?" I asked, stepping back to let them in. "Starving," Malik said, already heading for the kitchen. "Mom made some fancy quinoa thing for lunch. I'm dying for real food." Ava giggled. "It had beets," she whispered, like it was a curse word. "Pizza it is then," I said. "But you're helping. Chef's orders." Have you ever had something as simple as kids bickering over toppings feel like proof you're not in fact the disaster someone painted you as? We found a rhythm. Mornings were school runs and last-minute homework panics. Afternoons were homework, then video games or bike rides, depending on the weather and my energy level. Evenings, we cooked together more often than not. Sometimes out of necessity, stretching my grocery budget meant more beans and rice than takeout, but also because there was something healing about showing them how to season food, how to chop an onion without losing a finger. Real life skills, the kind nobody puts on a report card, but that make or break you when you're on your own. I still work nights. It wasn't glamorous. Sitting in a booth, walking slow rounds with a flashlight, making sure nobody was where they shouldn't be. But instead of hearing Lisa's voice in my head, calling it little security job, I heard my therapist asking, "How do you feel after a shift?" Tired, but also steady. Not keyed up like I'd been back in the war, not hollowed out like the office gigs had done me. I wasn't building a legacy in the corporate sense, but I was still protecting something. Property, people, my own ability to be present for my kids during the day. Have you ever realized that the job that looks like failure from the outside is actually the one keeping you whole enough to show up where it matters? Lisa didn't soften overnight. There were snide comments at pickups. "Did you remember their meds this time? Try not to keep them up all night on those games, okay?"
Once, in front of the kids, she snapped, "If you just taken your career seriously, we wouldn't have to juggle like this." I opened my mouth, ready to lash back, then caught Malik's face, jaw clenched, eyes darting between us like a ref in a fight he didn't sign up to officiate. "Lisa," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could, "we are not doing this in front of them. You have concerns, we talk like adults, without an audience." The old me would have swallowed it or exploded. This version, backed by a judge's words, by the knowledge that I had as much right to parent as she did, drew a line. It didn't magically make her listen, but it did something more important. It showed the kids there was another way to be a grown-up besides constant scorekeeping. Have you ever had to be the example you wished you'd had while you were busy becoming the person you are? One night, a few months after the ruling, Malik knocked on my bedroom door. "You awake?" he asked, peeking in. "Yeah, bud," I said, setting my book aside. "What's up?" He hovered in the doorway, lanky teenage frame, too big for the Spider-Man pajamas he still wore when he thought no one was looking. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Always." He stepped in, shut the door behind him like we were about to discuss state secrets. "Mom said, she said the only reason you got joint custody is because the judge felt sorry for you because of your war stuff," he muttered. "Is that true?" My first instinct was anger at her, at the way she kept trying to reframe the story to make herself the righteous one. But under that, I heard the real question. Do you deserve to be my dad, or did you trick the system? I patted the edge of the bed. "Sit," I said. He did, shoulders tense. "The judge didn't feel sorry for me," I said slowly. "He knew more of my story than your mom's lawyer did. That's different." "Because of Afghanistan?" he asked. "Partly. He knew I'd been responsible under pressure, that I hadn't quit when things got hard, that I'd taken care of my unit. But he also looked at what I'd done here, with you and your sister." I ticked things off on my fingers. "Who cooked for you when Mom worked late?" "You," he admitted, eyes on his hands. "Who took you to the doctor when you broke your wrist?" "You." "Who showed up to your parent-teacher conferences, even when your report cards made me want to pull my hair out?" He snorted. "You." "So when Mom's lawyer said I was useless, the judge looked at all that and said, that doesn't match. That's not charity, that's justice." He was quiet for a minute. Then he said, almost under his breath, "I used to think you should get a better job too, something like Mom's, with a tie. I thought that's what made someone important." "I know. I thought that about myself some days." He looked up surprised. "Really? You think it feels good to tell people you're a night security guard when your ex-wife is a director? The world doesn't clap for guys like me. But you know what does? Your stomach when there's dinner on the table, your heart when you know your kids aren't home alone, my sanity when I don't come home from work wanting to punch a hole in the wall." He chewed on that. "So you're okay with just doing that?" "For now," I said. "Doesn't mean I won't ever change. I've been talking to the VA about maybe taking some classes, not because I'm trying to impress your mom or her friends, because I might want to build something different for me." I nudged a shoulder. "The point is, Malik, a better job isn't always the one that looks bigger on paper. It's the one that lets you be the man you want to be. After what I saw over there, I decided being your dad was the most important job I had. Everything else had to come second to that. Your mom thought that made me small. The judge thought it made me fit. I'm choosing to listen to the judge on this one." Have you ever heard yourself explain your choices to your kid and realized in the saying that you believe them more deeply than you thought? He nodded slowly. I glad you didn't leave us," he mumbled, like Grandpa did with Mom." There it was, the core fear, passed down like a bad family heirloom, parents disappearing, men leaving. "I didn't stay because I wanted a medal," I said, "because you're my son, because walking away would have killed something in me that no judge could ever fix. I didn't go to war to come home and quit on my own kid." He swallowed hard. "I know you're not useless," he said, "even when Mom says stuff. Mom's angry. Some of that's at me, some of it's at life, some of it's at her own dad. Doesn't make it right, but it's not your job to sort it out." I slung an arm around his shoulders. "Your job is to learn from it, to figure out what kind of man you want to be watching us. You can take the parts you like from me, from her, from anybody. Leave the rest." He leaned into the side hug for a beat, then pulled away with that embarrassed teen shuffle. "I'm gonna go pretend I wasn't emotional just now," he muttered, heading for the door. "Same here," I called after him. "Not a word to your sister." "What word?" Alva yelled from the hallway. "We didn't say emotional," I lied, grinning. Have you ever felt that even if the romantic chapter of your life is a mess of court transcripts and bitter words, the parental chapter still has a chance at a different ending? Months turned into a year. Lisa and I still clashed, but the temperature slowly dropped. She stopped using useless so freely. I think part of it was embarrassment. Word of the judge's little speech had got around our small legal community, and she didn't like being the woman who got publicly scolded for devaluing a veteran. Part of it, I'll admit, might have been watching the kids happily bounce between homes without falling apart the way she had predicted. When she got a big promotion and had to travel even more, the joint custody schedule we'd fought over turned into something she quietly relied on. "Can you take them an extra night this week?" she texted. Work trip came up. I could have thrown it in her face, could have said, "What happened to he's not fit to raise them?" Instead, I said sure. And I made sure the kids never heard those old words again. Not from me, not about their mother. That was my boundary too. Just because she tried to weaponize my flaws didn't mean I had to mirror it back. Have you ever decided to break a cycle not because the other person deserves it, but because your kids do? As for me, I did go back to school eventually, one class at a time, using the GI Bill, taking night courses once a week while the kids were with Lisa. Nothing fancy, project management, conflict resolution, stuff I realized I'd been doing in one form or another my whole life. I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it because sitting in that courtroom, listening to two versions of myself, the useless husband and the Sergeant Miller, I realized there was a third version I wanted to meet, James, the man who wasn't defined by his worst traumas or his smallest paychecks. When people now ask, "So what do you do?" I still say, "I work security," because that's true. I also sometimes say, "I'm a dad," because that's truer. And on rare occasions, when someone looks like they might actually listen, I say, "I try to be useful in ways money doesn't always measure." Because that's what that judge taught me without ever saying it directly. In that courtroom, my bank account didn't make me worthy. My rank didn't either. What did was the way I'd shown up, in war and at home when it counted. How I held the line for my squad, how I held my kids when they cried, how I kept going even when the woman beside me stopped seeing the value in it. That's what a useless husband doesn't do. I'm not saying every guy like me will get a judge who happens to be a man they once dragged to safety under a fire. Chances are you won't, but you might get a moment where the question isn't how much do you make, but who have you been? And when that moment comes, I hope you remember this. If you've been the one cooking, holding, showing up, staying,
You're not useless, no matter what your ex or your own doubts say. Have you ever had to wait for a stranger in a robe to remind you of something you should have known about yourself all along? I did. Now, when my own son gets frustrated with his life or questions his worth because his promotion's taking too long or his friends are posting highlight reels, I tell him money's nice, titles are nice. But one day when your kid is sitting in a courtroom or a classroom or a therapist's office talking about you, they're not going to say, "My dad made 6 figures." They're going to say, "My dad was there." Be there. Everything else we'll figure out. That's what I finally did, and no matter what name my ex threw at me, that's something nobody in any courtroom can ever take away.